Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. In this video, we'll be talking about a new process. We'll be looking at sexual selection. Well, we talked extensively before about natural selection, but now we want to focus on that facet of natural selection devoted to how individuals attract mates. Now, we talked briefly before about the advantages of sexual reproduction, but what we didn't do is we didn't address some of the striking outcomes in terms of both behavior and appearance. So let's dive right in. First, what is sexual selection? Well, again, natural selection and sexual selection are intrinsically related. Natural selection, again, is when you have heritable traits that aid the survival or reproduction, and those traits then spread in natural populations. Okay? Now, with sexual selection, we're going to be looking at just a subset of those features. We're going to be looking at those related to the ability to secure and reproduce with mates. Okay? Now, obviously, you need to reproduce to pass on your genes, and doing so better passes on more of your genes, so there's more copies of it in the population. So, if you can have traits that make you mate more, that's probably good. So if you have a trait that's attractive, that's good, right? Well, some traits that seem to be tied to one sex appear to be maladaptive to survival. They appear to be bad for survival. So this creates a bit of a conundrum. Now, how do these maladaptive traits spread? And why do we tend to see these things? Not always, but we tend to see these exaggerated traits in males. Let's look at a few examples here. So we have over here in the left top block, we have the extinct Irish elk. This had huge antlers. They're estimated maybe to have weighed on the order of 80 pounds or perhaps 35 kilograms. That's huge. Why on earth was it good to carry this heavy thing on your head? Well, we have a couple of other things that are probably familiar to you, like the peacock with its elaborate tail. In this case, it has it down. There's a rhinoceros beetle, but look at that big horn that it has there. And we have here the red-collared widow bird that has this very long extended tail. Well, Darwin saw all these things, and he figured something must be up. So what he suggested, and has since been confirmed many, many times, is that these traits are exaggerated through sexual selection. So here's a direct quote from Darwin. The habitual or even occasional preference by the female of the more attractive males would almost certainly lead to their modification. That because these are attractive, they are enhancing fitness overall, and they are spreading. Now, what Coyne actually clarified this in his book associated with this class, sexually selected traits will evolve if they more than offset the male's diminished survival with an increase in his reproduction. Right? So yes, although maybe he's more likely to be caught by a predator, since he mates so much more, it more than offsets that survival disadvantage. Well, there's a key for this to work. The key is you have to have a lot of mates. Okay? So how many mates do most organisms have? Well, when you look across the animal kingdom, multiple mates for males or females is quite common. Now, many of you are familiar with this idea of social monogamy. Social monogamy. That's when you have the social bond of one male with one female at a time. That people tend to think of ducks, though this is actually a poor example. People tend to think of ducks because they see the male duck and the female duck swimming around together. Now, separate from social monogamy, there's also sexual monogamy. And that's when partners are sexually exclusive with each other. Now, with the growth of DNA-based assays for paternity, what people have found is a lot of these species that appear to be socially monogamous were actually not sexually monogamous. In fact, extra-pair copulations are quite common. Now, the extra-pair copulations are when you're essentially breeding with somebody outside of your social pair. And this is quite common across much of the animal kingdom. And again, with more genetic data, we see this much better. Now, if we assume there are multiple mates, then the increase in number of matings or increase in number of partners will often increase your potential reproduction. Now again, this assumes non-monogamy, right? So this is an important facet to this, that we're assuming non-sexual monogamy. Now what's interesting is the difference between sexes in potential reproductive rate is very important. Like basically, how many offspring could you have? Well, let's look at the world records for humans, though I don't usually like using humans for these sorts of examples. The world record that's known for a human female is about 69 children. That is obviously huge. Now, what would you think the world record for a human male would be? Now, potentially you can think, well, how many kids could a male sire over the course of a year versus a female sire over the course of a year? The female, you're looking at 1 to 2, maybe a little bit more if they have multiple kids at a time. But with males, the potential reproductive rate is much higher. And in fact, the world record for a human male is somewhere between 867 and 1,000 over their lifetime. Again, the potential reproductive rate for males is much higher than the potential reproductive rate for females. Now, why this difference? Well, part of the reason is probably that females often invest far more in resources and in care, and that limits their reproductive opportunities. Right? So, for example, with a human female, if they're going to give birth to a child, they have this long period of labor through which they cannot be reproducing anymore. They are stuck with that period. And then even after that, there's this care post-reproduction that also slows them down. Now, an estimate from one study suggested that, on average, females devote 100 to 1,000 times more resources to egg production than males devote to ejaculate production. That's a pretty big difference. Just as one extreme example, many of you are probably familiar with the bird, the kiwi. Well, its egg is 15% of its overall weight. So just that physical investment in creating this one offspring is huge. Now, a lot of these ideas follow from an interesting principle. This is referred to as Bateman's principle. So let's look at this first in terms of the females and then in terms of the males. With the females, there's typically low variation in female mating success. But by that I mean that most females will tend to mate and they will tend to produce offspring. Okay. Now, interestingly, more matings by female does not necessarily lead to more offspring because, again, they're sort of capped. That they can copulate multiple times, but that's not going to increase the number of times they actually produce offspring for most animals. And they are limited by resources. Again, there's a high investment for producing these offspring. With males, a lot of that isn't true. There's typically very high variation in male mating success. There are some males who will produce many, many, many offspring with many different females, and there are a lot of males who will just produce no offspring. So there's quite a bit of this variation in male mating success. I'll show you an example of this in just a couple of minutes. Typically with males, more matings, and in this case meaning more matings with different females, will typically lead to far more offspring. And finally, they are limited by access to females. So there's a lot of this competition for access to females. Now, what is the relationship between mate number and offspring number? Well, let me show you one example. Here's the difference in outcome from having more mates. These are from studies of the rough-skinned newt, as you can see over here. Now, what I'd like you to look at is on the x-axis here, we have different numbers of mates. And on the y-axis, we have numbers of offspring. The orange dots there are for females. The blue dots are for males. Now, you look there at the correlation. For males, as you have more mates, you typically have a lot more offspring. With females, interestingly, as you have more mates, you don't typically have a lot more offspring. So how does that work? And one question people always ask is, how is this possible? Since everybody has a mother and a father, how can you get this difference? Well, let me give you some made-up but representative data to illustrate, and I'll show you some real data in a couple of slides. Here's a likely scenario what you might see within a species. When you look at variation in mating success within a mating season, with females, the vast majority will mate once. Some may mate 0, some may mate a little bit more, but on average, they're just getting mated and that's it. Mostly the reason for this is a lot of females actually, once they have mated in different species, will not mate again with another male for a while. Okay. Now what you'll see here for males, you see this much bigger spread, that a lot of males have no mates. Some have 1, some have 2, some have 3, but you have a couple of the super mates here, super males, who have many, many offspring. If you look at these two things, you have the same average number of matings for males and females, because again, every copulation has to involve one of each. But with females, most of them succeed once. With males, many, many fail, and and the subset are very, very successful. Now, this spread here leads to very intense competition among males. All the males want to be here to the right end of it. They don't want to be at the far left end of this. Let me show you some real data with elephant seals to illustrate. With elephant seals, and this has been studied quite extensively as one of the extreme examples, you have this super variance in male mating success. So in one study, they showed that 28% of males were observed mating at least once in a 2-year breeding season. So what does that mean? Is that probably about 72% were never observed to mate. So a large number of males were never successful. Now, among those that did mate, the average number of matings was quite high. They actually mated about 20 different times. Now, the distribution is highly correlated with the distribution of paternities. So those that did mate a lot did sire a lot of offspring. So you have this big spread for males. Here's an example from one group with 14 males that 11 bulls sired no pups, 2 bulls sired 1 pup each, and 1 bull sired 24 pups. So again, there's this intense competition. There's a couple of big winners, and there's a lot of losers with males, right? So again, this is very, very strong sexual selection. You don't tend to see this sort of spread with females because, again, the potential reproductive rate is much lower. Now, what is the outcome of this? Well, one outcome, which is quite interesting, is that we tend to see male-female dimorphisms correlating with sexual selection. What do I mean by dimorphism? By dimorphism, I mean some difference between males and females, often in physical size or weight. That, if you were, in this case here on the right, we have a dimorphic couple where the male is huge and the female is little. This case here, we have a monomorphic couple where they're about the same size. Typically speaking, when you have few males monopolizing most of the females, and you see this, then you tend to see this big difference in size between the males and the females. So in the case of the southern elephant seals I showed you earlier, the males can be as large as 8,000 pounds, whereas the females may be about 2,000 pounds. So big difference in size. Now with humans, you can see that, yes, there's an average difference, but we're a lot closer. There's probably not quite the same extreme variance in humans as you see in elephant seals. Now, when you have less variation in male mating success, the females and males tend to be more similar in size. So this is a decent indicator. And this pattern, you can't even see it when you look across primate species, so even including chimps, gorillas, etc. Now, it's not perfect, but it at least gives you some idea. So how might we leverage this? How might we leverage this association? Well, here's a couple of choices for you, and this is a question for you to answer. Could we use this to assess sexual selection in extinct species? Could we use this to assess sexual selection in newly discovered species? Or could we use it to study which characters are influenced by sexual selection? Or maybe all of the above. Think about that. Well, I hope that wasn't too difficult. The answer was indeed all of the above. We can use this to assess sexual selection in extinct species using fossils, because if we see this extreme dimorphism, and that tends to be associated with extreme variance in mating success, so strong sexual selection going on. So that's pretty cool. We can do the same thing with the newly discovered species, which we haven't had a chance to do extensive tests on, and we can look at the specific characters that are likely to be influenced by sexual selection, because those are the ones that are likely to show the greatest dimorphism. Okay? So, how does this competition occur? I've just been describing it in the context of competing for access to mates, but I haven't really gone into any more than that. Well, there's one sex, typically the males, that is subject to the strong sexual selection. Now, in this case, there should be competition. There should be competition among the males for the females. So it's competitive. There might be fighting. There might be, something to keep other males away from the females. Now, there's the other sex, typically the females, is subject to much weaker sexual selection because they all tend to get mated to and produce offspring. That sex, the one which is under weaker sexual selection, should tend to be choosy. They can be very picky. They can afford to be picky because they know they're going to mate. I mean, I'm anthropomorphizing. They don't actually think this. But there's a high probability that they will mate, so they can afford to be quite picky. Okay. Now, Darwin recognized these two types of sexual selection that broadly referred to as male competition and female choice. And that will be the subject of our next video. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this. Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. In the previous video, we talked about how the greater variance in mating success for males made it so sexual selection was typically more intense on males than on females. That typically speaking, in many animal species, or at least in a stereotyped animal species, each female would be mated, but there would be this tons of variance where a lot of males never mate, and a couple of males were very, very successful at mating. So what this did is it created the opportunity for two different forms of sexual selection, both of which were recognized by Darwin. That of competition among males, and that for choice by females for particular kinds of males. So let's look at each of these in turn. Let's start with male competition. So how is it that males compete amongst each other for access to females? Well, I'll talk about three brief types. One is direct combat and things related to that, such as forming hierarchies. The second being territoriality, And the last looking at particular strategies males can employ for maybe being sneaky in some ways to get access to females. Now, the most obvious form of sexual selection is direct combat amongst males, right? Or essentially, it's not uncommon for males to battle for access to females. In fact, we know this from our own cultural references. Many of you are familiar with the story of Helen of Troy as a classic example of a very long battle among males for access to a particular female. But we see this in all sorts of other species as well, from insects, birds, and other mammals, etc. Now, these battles, although not uncommon, tend to be very costly. It's not good for you to injure yourself in the process of trying to stake a claim for a female or a set of females. So what a lot of animals have done to compensate for this, again, not thinking this through, but just evolutionarily this has happened, is they compete without actually fighting to the death or damage. They have these sorts of displays, and then if it looks like this animal is stronger than that animal, based on this communication signal display, the other one backs off and says, all right, fine, you've won. Now, related to this, a lot of social species establish what's referred to as dominance hierarchies. And this is very different from the genetic dominance we talked about. In this case, we're talking about behavioral dominance. That basically somebody is the alpha male. Somebody is the top dog among this group. So if you have a set of males, there's one who is clearly recognized as being the top, another one may be recognized as being second, etc. Now, what may happen is, the top male who has access to whatever females he wants, he will frequently be challenged by these other males. And you'll have these fights sometimes, maybe suggesting some reordering of the hierarchy, but by and large, everybody acknowledges this is the top male. Now, there's advantages to this because, again, you're not fighting to the death, you're not having this sort of frequent injury and things like that. By having this hierarchy exist, everybody just knows what's supposed to happen. Now, a related thing, or alternative to combat or dominance, is to delineate and defend a particular territory. In this case, males will try to keep other males away from their mates or their resources. And they may do this, they may try to signal others to stay away through vocalizing, as you can see this bird is doing here, as well as this elephant seal. We talked about the elephant seal extensively in the last video. They may make other sorts of visual displays to, fend off any other males. They may even have scent marking. We'll talk about another one in just a second. These sorts of delineations aren't just to keep away other males, but they may also be to attract the females. Hey, look, I'm a strong guy. I've got this great territory. Come on over here. Now, importantly, these territories are not necessarily all equal. In fact, frequently they're not equal. They will vary quite a bit in quality. That you tend to see the strongest or largest males defending the optimal territories. Those territories may be optimal because they have a lot of food sources, or they may be optimal specifically because that's where the females are. Now, a key part of this idea of delineating and defending a territory is intimidation. You need to keep other males away from your territory. So how do you do this? Well, animals have adopted a lot of different ways for doing this across species. So in the case of the red-winged blackbird that you see over here, he has these big red patches on his wings. And it's thought that those actually function for warding off potential threatening other males. The way the researchers have studied this, or one of the ways they've studied it, is to get stuffed red-winged blackbirds, the ones that were dead, and set them up there. And what they found is if the stuffed one had its patch painted over such that it was black, it was attacked very frequently by other males. In contrast, if there was this big red patch, the other males would basically leave it alone. So clearly, these red patches are enough to keep the other males away. Now, it's unclear why that's the case. Now, it could be this is some sort of indicator of ability, that maybe the males that have the big red patches tend to be healthier or something like that. We'll come back to that in the next video, but I just want to toss that out. But not all these signals are visual. Now, if you look below here, we have the red-eyed tree frog. Now, what this does is it'll tend to vibrate branches. And again, it's thought this sort of vibration is done to ward off other potential competing males who may want access to their territory. That seeing or feeling these vibrations will ward off their rivals. But again, maybe this is an indication of ability as well. Now, everything we've talked about so far has been in the context of this sort of attack, dominance, warding off other things. Sometimes animals like to be just a little bit sneaky instead. So here's the case when we're looking at different strategies for getting access to males. And remember, not all males need to do exactly the same thing. It might not be your best at this, and therefore that's the best thing to do. That maybe there's different approaches. So here in this case, we're looking at a marine isopod. This particular isopod has 3 different forms, and these are genetically determined. So there's what's referred to as an alpha form, a beta form, and a gamma form. Okay, the alpha form is sort of the typical male that you would imagine. This is a big male. It fights off intruder males. It guards harems of females, things like that. The beta male is a little bit more sneaky. What it does is it actually mimics a female, and it'll slip into the harem and sometimes have some activities there with the females in the harem. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is this gamma. These are very small ones. They tend to be very fast. Maybe they mimic juveniles, but again, they sort of slip into these harems and slip out. Interestingly, all 3 of these forms persist in individual populations, suggesting that on average, relative to their frequency, they're equally fit. So this is a very interesting case where you have these 3 different approaches for getting access to the females. Now, everything we've talked about so far in this video has been in terms of competition among males. So let's start looking at the other half. The females choose among these competing males as well. It's not just that you beat out the other males, but the female has to actually want to mate with the male. So what is it that females are attracted to? Because sometimes they will select amongst a pool of males that are all available. Well, they may be attracted to various visible characters or displays, so maybe having this long sort of tail isn't necessarily better for fighting off other males, like in the swordtail here, but maybe instead it's actually attractive to the females. There's some evidence that's true. It may be that females are attracted to good territories or nests, therefore they can be provisioned better. Or maybe they're attracted to particular kinds of calls or smells or something like that. Now, all these female preferences that exist will impose selection on the males, right? That males will respond to this, that those males that have the more attractive traits will get more matings, and therefore those traits will spread by natural selection. So let's look at one setting for where this female choice occurs. This is kind of an extreme one, that sometimes there are these competitive arenas for female choice, where you'll have a set of males all displaying together and almost in a competitive sort of way, and the females just kind of wander through and choose a male. So this is referred to as a lek. One of the most studied leks is that of the sage grouse, this particular bird down here. Again, all the males come together, they're doing their little dances and displays, the females wander through and they choose which ones they want. Now, some people have suggested that maybe bars are a human lek. No, I'm just kidding. I just want to toss that in there. But anyway, you see this sort of competitive arena does exist. Now, we've talked about competition as though it's something that's very obvious, but competition and choice may actually be less visible than is. Now, we've talked about competition and choice as being something that's very obvious, but in fact, both of those may be something that is not easily seen by an observer from the outside. So looking at this is a damselfly. And what the damselfly male does is he has a very interestingly shaped male penis that goes into the female, and it actually will remove sperm from the previous mating before he puts his in, or while he's putting his sperm in. So that's kind of an unusual way of basically getting rid of the competition from a previous mating with the female. And lest you think this is exclusive to insects, in fact, this is actually thought to occur in primates. That, in fact, chimps have spines on their penises. This picture over here is from a marmoset rather than a chimp. But see, these are these spikes on the marmoset's penis, on the side of his penis. And it's thought they use these penile spines to remove sperm from competitors when they mate with females. Fortunately, the human species has actually lost these spines, so we don't actually have those. Now, we talked about this now in the context of getting rid of the sperm from another male, but sometimes you have direct competition of sperm happening inside the female as well. It doesn't have to be just these dancing displays, but it could be something that's completely internal. Now, there's a couple of different ways this can happen. One is that some animals will ejaculate non-fertilizing products first, and what they're trying to do is essentially wash out or somehow incapacitate the earlier sperm. Right? So sperm actually have this sort of offensive, or ejaculates have these offensive and defensive capabilities. And sometimes this offensive one is basically just to wash out what's already in there. Other times you have this defensive capability where it'll somehow try to keep the sperm that's in there. Along those lines, a lot of animals have what's referred to as a copulatory plug. This is true in rodents and some insects and reptiles as well, where they'll put this gelatinous mass to try to basically plug in their sperm after their mating. So that's one strategy. Now, some animals will ejaculate very large quantities of sperm just to outcompete possible past sperm. Right? And some animals will this is a really sneaky one. They'll put anti-aphrodisiacs into the female. And what those anti-aphrodisiacs do is they make the female disinclined to mate again. It's basically manipulating the behavior of the female chemically by putting something in there. There's a lot of interesting strategies. Now, you may be wondering about this little bird that's sitting here in the corner. That is the dunnock. That is a European bird. What happens in that case is the male will come, when he's about to mate with the female, he'll peck at the cloaca of the female and basically try to force her to eject the sperm from previous matings. Not a very nice prospect. So, given what you've learned, in which of the following situations might you expect to see the most defenses to sperm competition evolve? Do you expect it in species in which females mate multiply? Do you expect it in species that have very little sexual dimorphism? We talked about that in the previous video. Do you expect it in species that have males successfully defending harems for multiple seasons? Or do you expect it in species with effective seminal fluid anti-aphrodisiacs? Think about that for a second and then try this question. Well, I hope that wasn't too difficult. The answer, as you saw, was indeed the first one. That you have to have multiple mating for sperm competition to be important. Well, why not these other ones? Well, if you have little sexual dimorphism, what does that mean? You may remember I said in the last video that sexual dimorphism correlates with the intensity of sexual selection, or basically the variance in mating success. So if you have very little sexual dimorphism, it's basically almost like having monogamy potentially. Right? So as you approach monogamy, you're going to have less sexual dimorphism. So you really don't expect this to be the case where you're going to need sperm competition. You don't expect it where males are successfully defending harems for multiple seasons, because if they're defending the harems for multiple seasons, then who are they competing with? Only themselves. And last but not least, again, if females have these anti-aphrodisiacs put into them, they're not going to mate again very readily, and therefore you're not going to have the same sort of intensity of competition. So let me close out this video by talking about why does female choice evolve? Well, there has to be some sort of benefit for this choice to evolve, or you'd think that would be true at least. So what are these benefits to the female for being choosy? Why don't they just mate with whatever male wins the fight? Why do they actually have to pick particular characters? And the other thing related to this is, how do these preferences spread in natural populations? Well, that will be the subject of our next video. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this. Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. In the previous two videos, we've talked about how the variance in male reproductive success leads to the opportunity for sexual selection, and we talked about different kinds of sexual selection, particularly different forms of male competition and different kinds of female choice and how females were choosing. Now, the thing we didn't address yet, this is the subject of this video, is what are the evolutionary causes? Basically, why is it that females prefer particular kinds of males? So let's explore that. Now, we have these female preferences and we have male characters. We're going to assume that there's heritable variation for both. Okay? So we're going to assume that there are alleles that confer stronger versus weaker preferences. We're going to assume that there are alleles that make the characters towards the more preferred or not. Now, importantly, the male characters will evolve in response to the preferences of females in that population. So if you're looking at, for example, this long-tailed widow bird in its population, the males have these very long tails, as illustrated by the name. The females prefer the longer tails, right? And thus males that have a long tails have a reproductive advantage, and these male long tail alleles will spread in the population. But again, we're trying to take a step back there. We're trying to see how these preferences came about to start with, and why did so many females in the population have this preference. By the way, in this particular example, how do we know that these kinds of things are actually preferred? Researchers have done these experiments where they've experimentally elongated the tails of these birds, and they found that the males would have even higher mating success if they had artificially lengthened tails. Okay, so let's look at the first of these possible explanations. This is one referred to as sensory bias. Okay? In this case, females basically prefer the male trait for some reason unrelated to mating. So they have some sort of bias such that they prefer something about this trait, but has nothing to do with the fact that the male has it whatsoever. So one possibility would be that the color perhaps matches that of food. And in fact, there's a real example of this from guppies, that some of these guppies actually have a preference for the color orange, matching some of the fruit that they eat. And the females like orange spots on the males. And this preference likely evolved in the context of food detection. Essentially, they were attracted to anything orange colored. A random mutation arose in a male, giving him this orange spot, and that made the female come to him and increased his reproductive success. So that's why this preference existed. It had nothing to do with the male whatsoever. And sometimes it may, in fact, just be kind of random with respect to the male. Another possible explanation is that somehow traits are depicting a direct benefit the female can receive. Right? So one possibility is that females may acquire resources directly from the male in response to mating with them. So in a lot of animals, you can actually get nourishment associated with the mating. So here we have a picture of the bush cricket. Now what she has here, she has a big spermatophore and an ampulla. So this is all something that was secreted by the male and given to the female. This A part right here, the ampulla, has the sperm, and you see that going into the female right now. But attached to it is this massive spermatophylax, which which has nourishment that she will then consume. So there you go. There's a direct benefit to particular kinds of males, the ones that are giving you this nourishment directly. Sometimes the females can acquire other sorts of resources from males, such as a better territory. Maybe they'll pick a male that will be better at taking care of her offspring. Maybe a male that will provide protection from other males or from predators. Or this last one sort of relates into this. It's possible you want to pick, as a female, you want to pick a male that is less likely to infect you with something bad. This is sometimes referred to as the healthy mate theory. That if somebody looks like this, you may be disinclined to mate with them just because you don't want to catch whatever it is that they have. That females will tend to avoid sickly-looking males. Right? That makes sense. Now let's look at some more indirect possibilities here. There's one theory referred to as good genes. And this is a case of an indirect benefit here. Now, this was proposed and tested by two researchers, Hamilton and Zuck. And what they saw was a negative relationship between bird plumage brightness and number of parasites that these birds had. Okay? Now, basically the idea is that colored feathers are costly to produce, so you can't actually produce them easily if you're physiologically stressed. Okay? So if you imagine that resistance to disease is hereditary, that some individuals have genotypes that are good for resisting disease, particular traits signal this hereditary resistance, then females will prefer to mate with males that have this resistance. That basically they're making sure their kids have good genes, and therefore their kids are better at passing on their alleles. So this is the idea of the good genes thing. The trouble with this is it's very hard to distinguish from the previous hypothesis, one of direct benefits, and particularly that sort of healthy mate idea. So this is one of the challenges there. Now, it's possible that both are actually true at some level, but it's hard to distinguish their relative contributions. There's another indirect one that's a little bit harder to sort through, and we're going to walk through this in multiple steps. And this is referred to as the sexy son model. Now let's walk through this again in pieces. Now let's imagine that there is variation in a female preference, and this variation is genetic. So some females have a preference, say for long tails, and some females have no preference. They'll mate with whoever. So we're going to say the ones that have this genetically determined preference are the ones here that have these red triangles. Okay. Now let's assume that the preferred trait is also genetic. Okay, so let's say it's long tails. So a subset of these males, these ones with the stars here, have the long tails. We'll refer to them as the sexy males. And again, this is genetic that they have this long tails. The rest of these males out here do not have long tails. Now let's imagine that those with the preference will only mate with the long-tailed ones. So these three females here with the red triangles will only mate with these two males with the stars. So what's going to happen? Well, let's take this piece by piece. Let's see what's happening in terms of the next generation's sons. So if we look at these females over here on the left that have no preference, they will mate with any of these males and probably in proportion to what they have. So let's say that each of these four females produces two sons, and let's say they do it from this whole set of males. So we'll see among the sons of the non-choosy females, they will be representative of the males of the previous generation. So 2 out of 8 of these sons have the long tail. 2 out of 8 of the males in the previous generation have the long tail. So nothing's changed there. Okay. Now let's look at the offspring from the choosy females. Well, the choosy females, if they have 2 sons each, they're only having sons from these couple of males. So all of these will have both the female preference allele and they'll have the male long-tailed allele. We're sort of ignoring a little bit here issues of having 2 copies or 1 copy and things like that. So let's just take this as a simplified example. So in this case, all these sons will have both the preferred character and the preference. So what happens after that? So let's put them all together. Here's the full set of sons from the next generation. There's obviously an advantage to the sexy males because they could mate with more females. So that's why we see a higher fraction overall of the sexy males there. But importantly here, we notice that a lot of these sexy males also now carry the alleles for the female preference. They will pass those on to their daughter. So because the sexy males are preferentially picked by the females that have the preference, they're preferentially passing on these preference alleles. So essentially, the preference kind of hitchhikes alongside the sexy trait. So there's an advantage to the preference because it actually is producing these sexier sons that pass along the preference itself. So in this case, the female preference spreads just because both it and the preferred character exist. Notice there was no intrinsic benefit to the preference. It wasn't like you were better at finding food. It wasn't like you were necessarily picking healthier males. You were just picking sexy males. So what happens from this is by having a female preference and having the preferred trait in the population, automatically both of them kind of spread. Now this process can cause the spread of somewhat random preferences. Now this is a very interesting idea, and it's referred to again as the sexy son. Now I present to you multiple models. How do we test among these models for sexual selection? Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult. This is a very active area of research. Now, the set of models I just presented to you are by far not comprehensive. This is just a subset of models for why female preferences may exist. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, many of the predictions overlap. It's very hard to distinguish, for example, direct benefits from the good genes model. And they're not mutually exclusive. It's possible that all of these are true, and they may all contribute. There have been a lot of computer simulation models, direct analytical models, and all of them have some merit, so it could actually work. So this, by far, is one of the most active areas of animal behavior research, and this is one of the things people are really trying to figure out. Well, I hope you found this was interesting. Thank you for your time.